If you think this story's intense, wait until you see what's coming next. Subscribe, turn on the bell, and step with me inside America's most feared prison. The sun over southern Colorado is merciless. It burns against the plains until everything, the dirt, the sky, the distant mountains, fades into one dry shimmer. Out here, 20 miles from the nearest town, rises a fortress of concrete and razor wire that locals call the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Officially, it's the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, ADX Florence. To most Americans, it's simply Supermax. When it opened in 1994, the Bureau of Prisons said it was built for the inmates who couldn't be controlled anywhere else. Men who killed behind bars, escaped from other prisons, or waged violence that scarred a nation. Each cell is a concrete bunker, 7 by 12 feet, a narrow window showing only a sliver of sky. No one walks freely here. Inmates move under escort, shackled and leashed. Doors open one at a time. Communication between prisoners is nearly impossible. ADX isn't designed for rehabilitation. It's designed to eliminate danger by eliminating contact. The idea for ADX was born out of chaos. In the 1980s, riots and murders plagued federal prisons. At Marion, Illinois, then the toughest facility, 2 correctional officers were killed the same day. The entire prison went into permanent lockdown, and officials realized even Marion couldn't contain its worst. They needed a place where escape was impossible and violence unthinkable. Architects and security experts in Washington designed a new kind of prison. One consultant called it a control unit that controls the human spirit. Another simply said, "This will be the end of the line." When ADX opened, its first residents arrived under heavy guard, gang leaders, spies, domestic terrorists, and headline-making killers. Each man passed through one gate and disappeared into silence. Reporters were rarely allowed inside. Those who managed it described corridors so still that footsteps echoed for minutes. Guards spoke softly as if sound itself was dangerous. One officer told the New York Times, "You can feel the tension in the concrete. The men behind these doors would kill if they could." For inmates, the routine was absolute. 23 hours in the cell, 1 hour alone in a small cage for exercise. Meals through a slot. No touch, no voices, no break in the monotony. Some said it felt like being buried alive. For the Bureau, though, ADX was a success. Violence across the system dropped. To the public, it looked like control restored. But letters began leaking out, uneven handwriting, desperate words. "I can hear my heartbeat in the walls. The silence is a scream." Among the early inmates was Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, serving life for a bombing campaign that killed 3 and injured many. His cell was like every other, yet his name made him the ghost of the place. A genius turned recluse, now sealed inside a concrete cabin. Nearby were men like Ramzi Youssef, mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and Terry Nichols from the Oklahoma City attack. Each had lived in chaos, now they lived in silence. For the guards, ADX demanded perfection. A single mistake, a cuff unlatched, a door unsecured, could mean death. Many said the stress haunted them. "You start dreaming in gray," one admitted. Outside, the town of Florence tried to ignore the monolith on its edge. Locals watched buses of staff arrive and convoys bringing prisoners. The economy grew, but so did unease. Parents warned their kids that's where the worst people in America go. In 2004, that unease hit headlines. Reporters interviewed former inmates and staff who described men smashing their heads against walls, begging for transfer, losing grip on reality. Lawsuits followed, claiming ADX violated the 8th Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. The Bureau denied it, insisting mental health care was provided. Yet the letters kept coming. "I came here sane, but I'm not sure I'll leave that way." By the mid-2000s, ADX had become legend. A cage for monsters, terrorists, drug lords, spies. But inside those walls were also psychologists, chaplains, and guards trying to survive the pressure. One officer remembered a night when alarms erupted. A prisoner had cut himself with metal from his sink. Paramedics rushed in, the crisis was contained, and then, silence. Radios clicked back to static. The corridor fell still again. That silence became the soundtrack of ADX. Not just an absence of sound, but the weight of thousands of unspoken thoughts pressed into concrete. Years passed. Few questioned what happened inside until internal memos leaked. Reports of hidden investigations, unrecorded incidents, and a rising number of inmates descending into psychosis. One memo contained a haunting line. "We have built a place to contain violence, but we may have built a place that breeds it within the mind." The line resurfaced years later during a congressional review, but for a long time, It lay buried like everything else inside ADX. Then in 2012, a former warden broke his silence. He described inmates who hadn't touched another human being in years, and staff showing signs of trauma themselves. His words sparked outrage and fascination. How could a system built for safety edge so close to inhumanity? Reporters demanded access. Cameras were allowed into certain wings, gleaming halls, spotless control rooms, but never the most restrictive units. The Bureau called it transparency. Critics called it theater. Then came the case that thrust ADX into international focus. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the cartel boss who escaped twice from maximum security prisons in Mexico. When he arrived in 2019, the U.S. vowed there would be no third escape. Guzman was placed in the special housing unit. The message was clear: no one leaves this place. But that transfer reignited an old question. What happens when every day is the same four walls, the same silence, the same slow erosion of time? Inside, inmates whispered through vents, trading fragments of rumor. New surveillance systems, missing reports, secret experiments. Most were dismissed as paranoia, until one morning proved something had been hidden all along. During a routine inspection, officers opened a service panel behind one high-security cell and found a hollow carved into the concrete, just large enough for a notebook. Inside, sealed in plastic, was a pouch marked only with a date and two initials. The handwriting was precise, almost military. It belonged to someone who was never supposed to leave a trace. And what was written inside changed everything. Every morning at ADX Florence begins the same way, with a silence so deliberate it feels engineered. No shouting, no footsteps, no doors slamming, only the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the clicking of surveillance relays. Officers who have worked here for years say the silence is the first thing you notice and the last thing you forget. At 5 a.m., the prison wakes in fragments. Lights flicker on inside hundreds of isolated concrete cells, tray slots open and shut, and for many inmates that narrow window in a steel door is their only link to the outside world. On this day, investigators began reviewing old logs, maintenance files, and complaints that never reached headlines, not because of violence, but because the patterns hinted that something inside the walls wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. It wasn't inmate behavior drawing attention, it was what the prison itself might be concealing. Inside these walls live men whose names once filled national news. The Unabomber, Ramzi Youssef, El Chapo, and members of organized crime and extremist networks. Each lives in a cell roughly the size of a walk-in closet, concrete bed, concrete desk, concrete everything but the steel. Meals come through a slot, recreation happens in isolated pens, and human interaction is nearly non-existent. Some inmates track time by guard footsteps, others by the sunlight creeping through a narrow window, and some simply detach. What happens during those long silent hours is largely unseen by the outside world, and that was about to change. In 2012, a quiet 100-page report was submitted to federal oversight offices. It didn't accuse ADX of brutality or corruption. It simply asked whether extreme isolation was pushing inmates past psychological breaking points, and whether those signs were being properly documented. The report noted unusual logbook entries, delayed medical requests, unexplained gaps in surveillance patrols, repeated complaints about lights and vents, and inmate statements that didn't align with official records. Nothing explosive, just a question ADX officials never wanted public. What exactly happens when the only witnesses are concrete walls and steel doors? H Unit, the most restrictive area, brought even more questions. Inmates under special administrative measures live in almost total communication lockdown. Yet investigators noticed rising complaints about the ventilation system. Voices carrying through ducts, mechanical noises disrupting sleep, temperature changes staff couldn't replicate. When maintenance finally checked the system, they found a section of ductwork repaired twice, but the original damage report was missing. No one claimed to have written it. A clerical error or something quietly removed from the record. More anomalies followed. In 2016, an officer noticed one cell showing no movement for nearly 14 hours. Cameras revealed a strange 7-second flicker at 2:14 a.m., not long enough for an alarm but long enough to raise concern. When officers entered the cell, the inmate was conscious but unresponsive, sitting upright and staring at the window slit. He remained silent for nearly 3 days. Psychologists later wrote, extended sensory isolation may have contributed to the dissociative state. Unusual but not unprecedented at ADX, and one more entry in a growing list of unexplained behavior. Years earlier, construction crews had discovered a small sealed cavity beneath a unit floor, a hollow space not shown on blueprints. Inside were old wires, a broken conduit, outdated inventory sheets, and a maintenance badge belonging to a technician who had left the prison a decade earlier with clean logs. How his badge ended up sealed in an undocumented cavity was never explained. The official conclusion was inconclusive, but staff claimed they often heard faint metallic noises in that area during night shifts. By 2018, external pressure grew. ADX wasn't under scrutiny for physical abuse, but for the psychological effects of long-term isolation. Then an investigative journalist uncovered a pattern. Multiple denied transfer requests citing the same issues: unexplained noises, failing lights, irregular ventilation, even though maintenance logs didn't match. FOIA requests returned heavily redacted pages, but one memo remained clear. Patterns appear consistent across units despite inconsistent maintenance logs. Whatever was happening wasn't isolated. The turning point came when inspectors found a nearly 20-year-old maintenance report describing an electrical failure, a brief ventilation shutdown, and an unscheduled reroute of internal communications. It looked routine until they noticed a handwritten note in the margin: check sublevel access, unauthorized movement recorded. No name, no follow-up, and no official reference to any sublevel. Yet when investigators checked modern maps, that sublevel had been erased entirely. A floor that once existed, removed from documentation, but almost certainly not from the building itself. And with that discovery, the mystery deepened. If there was a hidden sublevel beneath ADX Florence, who used it, and why was it wiped from the record? For nearly 20 years, ADX Florence existed beneath a deliberate hush. Inmates spoke little, officers followed protocol without deviation, and federal spokespeople kept their statements brief. To most of the outside world, ADX was simply a place where people vanished from public life. A fortress built to contain the nation's most dangerous offenders and nothing more. But in the late 2000s and early 2010s, that image quietly began to shift. It wasn't violence that drew attention, nor any dramatic incident, but something far more subtle: paperwork. Internal grievances, psychological assessments, medical notes, and civil complaints, documents that rarely made headlines, began forming a pattern that outside investigators couldn't ignore. More and more inmates were reporting signs of severe psychological strain, and those reports were finally reaching federal courts. ADX had been designed for inmates considered manageable, men who could withstand the demands of near-total isolation. But internal evaluations showed that many arrived with pre-existing mental health conditions, and for some, those conditions were deteriorating in the prison's silent, concrete environment. Psychologists documented cases of anxiety, insomnia, disorientation, long periods of muteness, and a slow erosion of social functioning. There were no outbursts and rarely any dramatic episodes, just a steady decline that spread through the files. One inmate repeatedly requested mental health evaluations, insisting that "the silence is eating at me." His records showed a prior diagnosis of schizophrenia. Another described the environment as a different kind of gravity, like the walls press back. These were not isolated remarks. Advocacy groups took notice, and soon the request for transparency began. Civil rights organizations filed FOIA petitions seeking medical records, behavioral assessments, suicide watch logs, staffing information, and internal audits. Much of what they received was heavily redacted, but even the scraps revealed troubling realities. ADX had fewer mental health staff per inmate than similar facilities. Therapy sessions were sometimes conducted through steel doors. Inmates often spent more than 22 hours a day completely alone, and some psychiatric evaluations lasted less than 15 minutes. As this information reached journalists, legal advocates, and researchers, pressure mounted. Then came the lawsuit that would change the institution's trajectory: Cunningham versus Federal Bureau of Prisons in 2012. The complaint argued that ADX was housing men with serious mental illnesses without providing adequate treatment, overusing extreme isolation, and failing to properly monitor psychological decline. It was not an angry lawsuit. It was clinical, evidence-driven, and supported by years of documentation. Filings stated plainly that prolonged solitary confinement could worsen psychiatric disorders, and that ADX housed individuals whose symptoms were deepening under such conditions. The Bureau of Prisons initially defended its practices by emphasizing the prison's unique security needs. But as more evidence emerged, the tone shifted. By 2015, the BOP agreed to a major settlement. Reforms included increased mental health staffing, stronger screening procedures, more frequent evaluations, structured out-of-cell treatment, and clearer criteria preventing inmates with significant psychiatric conditions from being placed in extreme isolation. ADX was not being accused of cruelty, it was being redirected toward a more accountable model. As the reforms began taking shape, the prison entered a period of transition. Mental health units expanded, more clinical staff were hired, and federal monitors oversaw the implementation of new guidelines. Officers received additional training to adapt to the changing expectations. For inmates, life inside the concrete walls changed only slightly, but those small changes were meaningful. For observers, the secret of Fortress was slowly becoming more transparent. These adjustments came at a time when ADX was receiving new high-profile inmates, Jakar Sarnaev, Richard Reed, Zacharias Moussaoui, and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, each with complex legal, security, and political considerations. Their arrival renewed public interest in how ADX managed such individuals. The Bureau clarified its use of special administrative measures, designed to restrict communication and prevent outside influence, but those same restrictions sparked debates about cognitive impact and long-term psychological effects. Suddenly the question wasn't just about safety, but about the boundary between security and human preservation. Amid this, journalists also turned their focus toward the staff. Officers described long hours, heavy stress, and a work environment defined by precision and silence. One officer remarked that ADX wasn't chaotic at all, it's the silence that gets to you. Another explained that every action was scripted, every movement planned, and that the mental burden could be significant. Turnover rates rose. Training intensified. It became clear that the institution's challenges affected everyone within its walls, not just the men in the cells. By the late 2010s, ADX Florence had become the subject of national media coverage, documentaries, investigative articles, and legislative discussions. Debates centered on isolation, transparency, mental health, and the ethical responsibilities of a modern Supermax facility. Advocacy groups pushed for accountability, while federal officials defended the prison's necessity in managing the country's most high-risk individuals. The conversation was no longer confined to court filings and internal memos, it had become a public discussion. As Chapter 3 closes, ADX Florence stands in a strange balance. It remains the most secure federal prison in the United States, home to some of the nation's most closely monitored inmates. But it is also an institution reshaped by lawsuits, reforms, investigations, and growing scrutiny. The walls still stand, the routines still play out with mechanical precision, and the isolation remains profound. Yet for the first time since its doors opened, the world is watching with greater attention than ever before. ADX Florence was built to be impossible to escape. No inmate has broken out. The facility's walls, sensors, pressure pads, fiber optic cameras, and remote-controlled steel doors create a system where containment isn't just a goal, it's the foundation. But ADX's reputation didn't come only from its architecture. It came from the men who tried to escape other prisons before ADX existed, forcing the federal system to rethink everything. Before ADX, high-risk inmates, gang leaders, terrorists, cartel figures, bomb makers, and master manipulators were spread across various facilities. Some orchestrated escapes in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, and a few succeeded. The 1984 incident at the federal prison in Marion, Illinois, where 2 inmates exploited movement patterns and attacked officers, became the final trigger. ADX was designed after reviewing decades of such attempts. Tunnels were eliminated by reinforced foundations. Overpowering guards became nearly impossible due to restricted contact. Fences, walls, and perimeters were redesigned so nothing could be climbed or crossed. Escape simply disappeared as a variable. Yet the challenge shifted, from physical escape to communication manipulation. Inmates attempted to exploit mail, legal visits, phone calls, and loopholes. Ramzi Youssef's coded correspondence and a gang leader's subtle signals and letters led to tighter special administrative measures, stricter mail reviews, and enhanced oversight during legal visits. True internal breaches were rare but real. A 2011 Department of Justice review found issues with documentation, occasional staff turnover, and a few protocol violations. None compromised safety, but each exposed how even the strongest system depends on people. Training increased, digital logging improved, and oversight expanded. Inside ADX, layers of technology quietly run the institution. Micromotion sensors, vibration detectors, pressure pads, redundant monitoring rooms, and reinforced structural design. Every communication is monitored, recorded, logged, and routed through secure channels. This relentless control protects the public, but it comes with a human cost. Staff face high stress, burnout, and hypervigilance. Inmates experience mood disturbances, disorientation, and long-term isolation effects, even after reforms. Ethical debates continue: security necessity versus psychological impact. Several events intensified scrutiny, including the 2015 Colorado lawsuit about medical access, international concerns over SAMs, and global attention when Joaquin El Chapo Guzman arrived in 2019. His transfer reignited debates about communication limits and isolation, but he never tested the system. Despite criticism, ADX Florence remains fully operational, with no serious federal discussion of closure. For certain high-risk individuals capable of orchestrating harm from behind bars, no other U.S. facility offers its level of containment. ADX is not simply a prison, it is a national security tool. Its story is built on engineering, policy evolution, human psychology, and lessons learned over decades. It remains the most secure prison in America not because of myth, but because every part of it, from staff discipline to technology, is engineered to prevent failure. The Colorado sun was barely visible when federal inspectors arrived at ADX Florence for the final stage of a months-long investigation. The prison didn't need alarms or theatrics. Its silence carried its own gravity. For years, concerns about solitary confinement, mental health decline, and inadequate oversight had been building through reports, testimonies, letters, and official warnings. Now, auditors were inside, moving cell by cell, reviewing the isolation units where men lived 23 hours a day alone. What they found wasn't chaos, but quiet deterioration. Records showed inmates struggling with flat speech, long pauses, confusion, withdrawal, subtle signs of minds wearing down. Few prisoners arrived severely psychotic, yet many developed troubling symptoms after years in isolation. Inspectors described ADX as physically efficient but psychologically barren, a place that met basic needs while eroding mental resilience. As they reviewed decades of documents, a pattern emerged: cases of neglect hidden in paperwork rather than headlines. Some inmates went months without real psychological contact. Others filed repeated requests for medication that were never addressed. Reports documented paranoia, hallucinations, compulsive behaviors, and sensory distress, all acknowledged, rarely resolved. The failures weren't intentional. They were structural, the byproduct of a system built to control rather than heal. Legal pressure had already been growing. Attorneys argued that ADX was never meant to house inmates with serious psychiatric disorders. Judges echoed the concern, noting that the Constitution demanded acknowledgement of what prolonged sensory deprivation does to the human mind. By the time the investigation ended, lawsuits from inmates, advocacy groups, and even former staff were stacking up. The final report, over 500 pages, didn't accuse ADX of abuse or misconduct. Instead, it delivered a more unsettling truth. The prison was functioning exactly as designed, and that design was psychologically damaging. The Department of Justice ordered reforms: improved screenings, more face-to-face evaluations, expanded step-down programs, and increased oversight. But none of these changed the core architecture of the most secure prison in the country. The most haunting conclusion surfaced when inspectors analyzed decades of data. The same psychological decline appeared in inmates regardless of their crimes, histories, or mental health starting point. Terrorists, gang leaders, cartel figures, and even inmates who arrived stable showed similar patterns over time. One psychiatrist summarized it starkly: ADX doesn't just contain people, it transforms them. Even more troubling, data showed that inmates released directly from ADX had higher rates of instability after leaving custody than those released from any other federal facility. The prison's impact didn't end at the gate, it followed them into the world. The report's final line was cold and clinical: ADX Florence fulfills its mission, but the psychological consequences of its design are unavoidable. There was no proposed solution, only acknowledgement. The walls still stand, the inmates remain inside, and the country continues to debate the cost of absolute security, and who ultimately pays that cost.